The pre-dawn chill of the Wyoming high country was a liar. Eli Robbins knew it in his bones. It was a fleeting promise of relief before the sun rose to become a hammer, beating the dust from the hard-packed earth and turning the air to a shimmering, breathless haze. He splashed cold water from the basin onto his face, the shock of it a welcome jolt. Today was the day the train arrived. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. The fire in the cook stove was coaxed back to life, its warmth a small comfort in the vast silence of the cabin. Coffee, thick and black, was soon boiling. Outside, the first pale streaks of dawn painted the horizon, silhouetting the jagged teeth of the distant mountains. His ranch was a lonely speck in an immense, unforgiving landscape. It had been his and Martha's dream. Now, it was just his and the ghost of her laughter, a sound that grew fainter with each passing year. His 6-year-old daughter, Ruth, was still asleep in her small bed, her pale hair fanned out on the pillow, a stark contrast to the dark curls he remembered of his late wife. It was for Ruth, mostly, that he had done this. A child needed a mother's touch, a woman's guidance. He could mend fences, break horses, and pull a calf from its struggling mother. But he couldn't braid hair worth a damn, and his attempts at singing lullabies usually ended with Ruth covering her ears. 3 months ago, driven by a quiet desperation, he had penned a letter to a matrimonial agency back east. His words had been as stark and practical as the land he worked. Widower, 32 years of age, owner of a modest cattle ranch, seeking a wife of good character and sturdy constitution. Must be willing to work hard and be a mother to my young daughter. I can offer a respectable home and my protection. I do not seek romance, only a reliable partner to share the burden of this life. The reply had come from a Miss Clara May Thompson of Boston. Her letters were brief, written in a neat, elegant script that seemed out of place in his calloused hands. She wrote of wanting a new start, of being practical herself, of understanding the terms he had laid out. There were no flourishes, no romantic notions. She sounded sensible, plain. That was the word he clung to. He had conjured an image of her in his mind, a woman with a square jaw, capable hands, and a quiet, unassuming nature. Someone who wouldn't be startled by the harshness of this place or the silence of his heart. He didn't need another love to lose. He just needed a helpmate. After a breakfast of biscuits and gravy, which he shared with a now awake and chattering Ruth, he hitched the wagon. The town of Harmony Creek was a 2-hour ride away, a journey through rolling plains of sagebrush and sun-scorched grass. Harmony Creek was a name born of wishful thinking. It was a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled along a single, dusty street, a place where the wind was the most constant resident. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith, and the church stood as weary sentinels against the vast emptiness. Life here was stripped to its essentials: survival, work, and God, in roughly that order. And judgment. Society in these parts was governed by a set of unwritten rules as rigid as iron. Reputations, especially a woman's, were fragile things, easily shattered. A woman who was too loud, too forward, or who carried the slightest whisper of a sullied past was branded. The label of being impure was a life sentence, isolating a woman more effectively than any prison wall. The good wives of the town, clad in their bonnets and righteousness, would gather in sewing circles, their whispers as sharp and damaging as sewing needles. Eli knew this. He'd seen it happen. He prayed that Miss Thompson was the sort of woman who would blend in, her plainness a shield against scrutiny. The train was due at noon. He tied the wagon near the station, a simple wooden platform that seemed to bake under the oppressive sun. The air was thick with the smell of hot dust, horse manure, and the distant promise of rain that never came. A few other townsfolk milled about, their curiosity piqued. The arrival of the train was an event, and the news of Eli Robbins's mail-order bride had spread through Harmony Creek like a grass fire. He could feel their eyes on him, their speculative glances. He ignored them, focusing on a loose nail on the platform, his jaw tight. He thought of the letters one last time. Simple, direct, honest. He'd been honest, too. He'd told her about Martha's passing from fever, about Ruth, about the relentless work. He expected the same honesty in return. All he needed was a good, plain woman. Then he heard it, a low whistle that grew into a thunderous chugging, the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel, the locomotive, a great black beast breathing smoke and steam, rounded the bend and screeched to a halt, enveloping the platform in a hot, metallic cloud. Doors opened. A few salesmen in dusty coats got off, followed by a family with too many children. Eli scanned the faces, searching for the plain, sturdy woman from his imagination. And then she appeared in the doorway of the last car. The entire platform went silent. The idle chatter ceased. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Eli felt the air leave his own lungs in a sharp, involuntary rush. This was not a plain woman. She was tall and slender, with a posture that spoke of a grace that had no business being in a place like this. Her dress was of a simple, dark blue calico, worn and faded from many washings. Yet it hung on her frame as if it were the finest silk. Her face was pale, unadorned by powder or rouge, and framed by a mass of dark auburn hair hastily pinned up, with loose tendrils escaping to catch the harsh sunlight like threads of fire. She wasn't beautiful in the rosy-cheeked, robust way of the local girls. Her beauty was of a different, more haunting quality. It was in the delicate arch of her brow, the elegant line of her jaw, and most of all, in her eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths was a sorrow so profound it seemed to have carved out a permanent home there. She paused at the top of the steps, her gaze sweeping over the dusty town and the staring faces. A flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or resignation, crossing her features. Then she descended, moving with a quiet dignity that was a world away from the rough-hewn backdrop of Harmony Creek. Eli was frozen. This was a mistake, a terrible, catastrophic mistake. This woman would break in this land. She would be eaten alive by the gossip and the hardship. He had sent for a draft horse and been sent a thoroughbred. She saw him then. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse, and for a moment he felt a jolt, a connection so unexpected it nearly made him take a step back. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, before looking down at the small, worn satchel she carried. He forced his leaden feet to move, stepping forward, pulling off his hat and twisting the brim in his hands. "Miss Thompson?" he managed, his voice sounding rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. "Mr. Robbins," she replied. Her voice was low and soft, with a cultured accent that sounded like music compared to the flat drawl of the West. She did not offer her hand, but kept her fingers curled around the handle of her bag. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." There was no pleasure in her eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness. He felt a clumsy, foolish oath. "Welcome to Harmony Creek," he mumbled. It's hot." A faint, sad smile touched her lips but didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, it is." The ride back to the ranch was steeped in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Ruth sat between them on the wagon seat, stealing shy, wide-eyed glances at the beautiful stranger. Clara, for her part, sat perfectly erect, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She did not seem troubled by the dust or the jolting of the wagon. She seemed contained, a world unto herself. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Eli gestured toward the simple log cabin. "This is it. It's not much, but it's sturdy." Clara took it all in. The cabin, the barn, the vast, empty sky, with that same quiet, unreadable expression. "It's a home," she said softly. That evening was an exercise in awkwardness. Clara moved about the small kitchen with a surprising competence, helping to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. But she worked in silence, her movements economical and reserved. Ruth, who usually chattered nonstop, was cowed into a similar quiet, watching Clara with a mixture of awe and suspicion. After the meal, Eli showed Clara to the small spare room at the back of the cabin. It had been his storage room, but he'd cleared it out, putting in a narrow cot and a small washstand. "It's not much," he said again, feeling the inadequacy of his preparations. He had prepared for a different woman entirely. "It's more than enough. Thank you," she said, her back to him as she placed her satchel on the cot. "I am very tired from the journey." It was a polite dismissal. He nodded, retreating to the main room. "Good night, then, ma'am." "Good night, Mr. Robbins." Later, long after Ruth had been put to bed, Eli sat in the dark, the embers in the stove casting a faint glow. He couldn't settle. His mind was a churning mess of confusion and a strange, unfamiliar disquiet. He had wanted simple. He had wanted uncomplicated. The woman in the next room was neither. A sliver of lamplight appeared under her door, a faint golden line in the darkness. He watched it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He knew nothing about her. Really. Not about the source of the profound sadness in her eyes, or the reason a woman who looked like she belonged in a drawing room was now in a dusty cabin in the middle of nowhere. He had sent for a gentle rain to settle the dust of his life. Staring at that line of light, he feared he had invited a storm. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Clara, Eli discovered, was a silent and tireless worker. She rose before him, the scent of coffee already filling the cabin when he came in from the pre-dawn darkness. She learned to milk their lone cow, Bessie, her movements at first hesitant and clumsy, but soon becoming sure and rhythmic. She kneaded dough for bread with a fierce determination, her slender arms dusted with flour, her brow furrowed in concentration. The first loaf was as hard as a river stone, but the next was better. And by the end of the week, the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of freshly baked bread that made even Ruth smile. Eli watched her, a silent observer from across the small cabin. He saw the way she scrubbed their plates in the basin of cold well water until her hands were raw and red. He saw how she never complained about the endless list of chores that would have broken a lesser woman. She was a mystery. She moved with an innate grace that seemed better suited for a ballroom than a dusty ranch. Yet she tackled the back-breaking labor of this life as if it were a penance she was duty-bound to pay. She spoke little, offering only polite, necessary responses. The wall around her was high and thick, and Eli, a man unskilled in navigating such things, had no idea how to breach it. The land itself seemed determined to test her. The brief mercy of spring gave way to the full, brutal force of a Wyoming summer. The sun baked the plains until the ground cracked open in a spiderweb of fissures. The grasses turned from green to a brittle, dusty gold. Hot, relentless winds blew in from the south, carrying clouds of grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. One afternoon, the sky turned a sickly yellow-brown as a dust storm rolled in, a monstrous churning wall that blotted out the sun. They huddled inside the cabin, listening to the wind howl like a grieving animal as fine silt seeped through every crack in the walls, covering the furniture and floor in a fine, gritty powder. Through it all, Clara remained impassive, her face a mask of quiet endurance. A trip to Harmony Creek for supplies 2 weeks after her arrival brought the land's quiet hostility into the sharp focus of human cruelty. As Eli loaded sacks of flour and beans into the wagon, he left Clara and Ruth for a moment at the general store. He saw it happen from across the street. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, and another woman, Martha Putnam, cornered Clara near a barrel of pickles. They did not speak to her directly. Instead, they spoke to each other, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry, "So refined, isn't she? Mrs. Gable said, her eyes scanning Clara from head to toe. Hardly looks the type for ranch life. One wonders what brings a woman of her delicate nature all the way out here alone. Indeed, Mrs. Putnam added, her lips pursed in a thin line of pious judgment. Boston is a long way off. A woman with family and good standing doesn't just pack up and leave it all behind, not unless she has a reason to run. Clara stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over their shoulders. Her face was pale, but her expression didn't change. She absorbed their venom like the dry earth absorbed a sparse rain, showing no outward sign of the sting. Eli felt a hot, unfamiliar rage surge in his chest. He strode across the street, his boots kicking up dust. The two women turned, their faces feigning pleasant surprise. "Mr. Robbins, Mrs." Gable chirped. "We were just admiring your new wife." "She's not my wife yet," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "And she has a name. It's Clara." He looked directly at Clara, his eyes asking a question she didn't answer. "We're leaving." The ride home was heavy with a new kind of silence. It wasn't just awkwardness anymore. It was the weight of injustice. Eli's hands were clenched on the reins. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He had brought her here. He had subjected her to this life, to these people. He had promised his protection, but he didn't know how to protect her from whispers. He was a man of action, of fences and cattle, not of words and social subtleties. He wanted to smash something, but instead, he just drove the wagon, the silence stretching between them like the vast, empty plains. That night, after a supper eaten in near silence, the incident hung in the air. As Clara was clearing the table, a venomous, buzzing rattle echoed from just outside the open cabin door. It was a sound that made the blood run cold, the primal signal of hidden death. Clara, on her way to toss out the dishwater, froze in the doorway. A large rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike, was less than 2 feet from where she stood. She didn't scream so much as let out a sharp, terrified gasp. The sound shattered Eli's paralysis. He moved without thinking, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from its hook by the hearth. In 2 long strides, he was past her, putting his body between her and the snake. The snake struck, its fangs hitting nothing but air as Eli brought the poker down with a sickening crunch. He struck it again and again, a cold fury driving his movements until the creature was a broken, twitching mess in the dust. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving him breathing heavily. He turned to Clara. She was pressed against the doorframe, her face as white as bleached bone, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Did it get you?" She shook her head, unable to speak. He saw that she was trembling from head to toe, acting on pure instinct. He reached out and took her arm, meaning only to steady her. The moment his calloused, work-hardened fingers closed around the soft skin of her forearm, a shock went through them both. It was the first time they had truly touched. Her skin was warm, and beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve, he could feel the frantic, terrified pulse at her wrist. He looked down at his large, rough hand on her slender arm. It looked out of place, intrusive. She looked at it, too, her breath catching in her throat. The air crackled with a sudden, charged awareness that had nothing to do with the snake and everything to do with the man and woman standing in the twilight. He released her as if he'd been burned. She pulled her arm back, hugging it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just be careful by the door at night," he stammered, turning away to dispose of the dead snake, his heart hammering against his ribs for an entirely new reason. Something shifted after that night. The shared moment of terror and the forbidden touch that followed had chipped away at the wall between them. The change was most noticeable in Ruth, the little girl, who had been watching Clara with a wary curiosity, began to orbit her like a small moon. She would bring Clara a pretty rock she'd found, or a wilting wildflower. One afternoon, Eli came back from mending a fence line to find them sitting on the porch steps. Clara was taking apart one of Martha's old, worn-out aprons, and with a needle and thread, she was fashioning a tiny, perfect dress for Ruth's corn-husk doll. Ruth sat beside her, watching with rapt attention, handing Clara scraps of fabric. He heard the low murmur of their voices and, for the first time since her arrival, he heard Clara laugh. It was a soft, rusty sound, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time, but it was genuine. The sound hit him in the chest with a surprising force. They took to walking in the evenings, Ruth skipping ahead while Clara showed her which flowers were safe to pick, Indian paintbrush and bluebells that grew in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek. She wove a crown of them for Ruth's hair, her long, graceful fingers moving with a forgotten familiarity. Eli watched them from a distance, a dull ache in his heart. This was what he had wanted for his daughter, but the woman providing it was becoming something more than the sensible helpmate he had bargained for. She was becoming a presence in his life, a silent question he had no answer for. One evening, a week after the snake incident, they sat on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Ruth was asleep inside. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the lowing of a distant cow. "You're good with her," Eli said, breaking the long silence. "With Ruth." Clara didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on the darkening mountains. "She's a sweet child." "She's taken to you," he continued, feeling the need to fill the silence. You've been a bigger help than I had any right to expect." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned her head and looked at him, her eyes dark and shadowed in the twilight. The sadness he had seen on the first day was there, raw and unguarded. "Mr. Robbins," she began, her voice low and unsteady. "There are things you do not know about me." He waited, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden porch step. "I am not the person you think I am," she said, each word seeming to cost her a great effort. "The woman you imagined when you read my letters. She does not exist." A cold knot formed in Eli's stomach. "What are you talking about?" She shook her head, looking away again, pulling the invisible wall back up around her. "I cannot say more. Not now." She stood up abruptly. "It is late. I should go in." She disappeared into the cabin, leaving him alone in the gathering darkness with her cryptic words hanging in the air. He was no longer just a man with a mysterious bride. He was a man with a secret in his house, and he had a dreadful feeling that when that secret finally came to light, it would be powerful enough to shatter the fragile piece of the world he was trying so desperately to rebuild. The oppressive heat of summer finally broke in late September, surrendering to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant yellow, and the air, for the first time in months, held a clean, sharp edge that promised cooler nights. With the changing season came a shift in the mood of Harmony Creek. The harvest had been good, the cattle were fat, and the town was preparing for its annual festival, a day of feasting, games, and a barn dance that would last long into the night. It was an event that represented a semblance of civilization in the wilderness, a time for the scattered and isolated ranchers to come together. For Eli, it had always been a bittersweet occasion. It was at a harvest dance that he had first courted Martha, and after she was gone, the sound of the fiddle music drifting from the town had felt like a mockery. This year, however, a new, tentative thought took root in his mind. He wanted to go, and he wanted to take Clara. He broached the subject one evening as they sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. Ruth was chasing grasshoppers in the twilight, her laughter a bright, tinkling sound. "The town's holding the harvest festival this Saturday," he said, trying to sound casual, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There's a dance, plenty of food." He cleared his throat. "I thought maybe you and Ruth would like to go." Clara, who had been mending one of Ruth's dresses, stilled her hands. She didn't look up from her sewing. I don't think that is a wise idea, Mr. Robbins. It's Eli, he said, a familiar frustration pricking him. She had been with them for over a month, and still maintained a formal distance. And why isn't it wise? She finally lifted her head, and in the fading light, he could see the apprehension in her eyes. You saw how they are in town. The women, they watch me, they whisper. Her voice was low, devoid of self-pity, stating it as a simple, unchangeable fact. Going to a festival would only invite more of it. It would be uncomfortable for you and for Ruth. I don't give a damn what they think, he said, with more force than he intended. And Ruth's been talking about the dance for a week. She wants to see the fiddler. As if on cue, Ruth ran up to the porch, her face flushed and her hair full of twigs. Are we going to the dance, Pa? Clara, will you come? They have lemon cakes. Clara looked at the child's hopeful, upturned face, and Eli saw the resolve in her own features waver. He saw the conflict there, her deep-seated fear of exposure warring with her growing affection for his daughter. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then, a slow, resigned sigh escaped her lips. All right, Ruth, she said softly, her hand reaching out to brush a leaf from the girl's hair. We will go and see the fiddler, and we will find you a lemon cake. On the evening of the festival, Eli found himself pacing the cabin, a nervous energy thrumming through him that he hadn't felt in years. He had scrubbed himself clean, put on his best shirt, the one that wasn't faded at the collar, and had even tried to tame his hair with a bit of water. When Clara finally emerged from her room, he stopped his pacing. She was wearing a simple dress of white lawn, one of the few she owned. It was plain, without lace or adornment, but on her, it was luminous in the lantern light. It made her skin look like cream and her dark auburn hair, which she had twisted into a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck, seem even richer. She wore no jewelry, no paint on her face, but she possessed a quiet, breathtaking elegance that made his heart ache. He felt a sudden, fierce wave of pride, a possessive urge to stand beside her and declare to the world that this woman was with him. You look nice, he said, the word utterly inadequate. She gave a small, nervous smile. Thank you. You as well. The center of town had been transformed. Lanterns were strung between the general store and the livery stable, casting a warm, flickering glow over the dusty street. A makeshift dance floor had been set up in front of the saloon, where a trio of musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and a man with a harmonica, were striking up a lively reel. The air was thick with the smells of roasted pork, wood smoke, and sweet cider. As Eli helped Clara and Ruth down from the wagon, a hush fell over the nearest cluster of people. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Every eye was drawn to them, to the quiet, stern-faced rancher and the beautiful, sorrowful-eyed woman at his side. Eli felt Clara tense, her arm linked through his, her fingers gripping him with a subtle, desperate strength. He placed his other hand over hers, a gesture of reassurance, and led them through the crowd toward the long tables laden with food. He was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers that erupted in their wake. He ignored them, focusing on getting plates of food for Ruth and Clara, finding them a seat on a hay bale at the edge of the light. For a while, they were left alone. They watched the dancers, their feet stomping in time to the music. Ruth, her mouth full of lemon cake, stared at the fiddler with wide-eyed adoration. Eli even saw Clara's lips curve into a genuine, unguarded smile as a small boy tripped over his own feet while trying to dance with a girl twice his size. In that moment, under the lanterns and the stars, with the music swirling around them, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could build a life here, together. It was then that a man stepped out of the shadows of the saloon. He was not a local. He wore a city suit that was too flashy for this place, and his dark hair was slicked back with pomade. He moved with a confident, predatory swagger, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on their small group. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face as he began to walk toward them. Eli felt a prickle of unease. He didn't know the man, but he recognized the type, a gambler or a salesman, full of cheap talk and easy smiles. The man stopped directly in front of Clara, ignoring Eli completely. His eyes roamed over her, from her neatly pinned hair to the simple white dress, a look of amused surprise on his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice smooth and slick. "Never thought I'd see you in a place like this, all done up like a preacher's daughter." He chuckled. "Lily? Lily Bell. Is that really you?" The name hit the air like a stone. Eli saw the blood drain from Clara's face. She looked as if she had been struck. The small smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, stark terror. Her hand flew to her throat, and she rose to her feet, stumbling back a step. "You have me mistaken for someone else," she said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. The man's smirk widened. "Oh, I don't think so. I'd never forget a face like yours. Not after all those nights at the Nightingale. You had the whole city eating out of your hand." Eli was on his feet now, moving to stand between them. "I think the lady told you that you're mistaken," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You should move along." The man finally looked at Eli, his eyes dismissive. "And who might you be? Her new protector?" He laughed again, a harsh, unpleasant sound. But Clara wasn't listening. She grabbed Eli's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Please," she choked out, her eyes wide and frantic. "We have to go, now, please, Eli." It was the first time she had used his given name. The raw panic in her voice cut through his anger and confusion. He looked from her terrified face to the stranger's smug one, and made a decision. He turned his back on the man, put a protective arm around Clara's shoulders, and guided her quickly toward the wagon, scooping a bewildered Ruth up with his other arm. The ride back to the ranch was a frantic, silent blur. Eli pushed the horses, the wagon wheels clattering over the rough road, leaving the sounds of the festival far behind. Clara sat rigid beside him, staring into the darkness, her body trembling. When they reached the cabin, he carried a sleeping Ruth inside and put her to bed before turning to face Clara in the main room. He lit a lamp, the harsh light illuminating the terror that still lingered on her face. His anger, held in check by the urgency of their escape, now returned, hot and bitter. It was mingled with a deep, humiliating sense of betrayal. "Who was that man?" he demanded. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "It doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't!" he exploded, his voice echoing in the small cabin. "He knew you. He called you Lily Bell. What does that mean?" She wouldn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the floorboards. "Please, don't ask." "Don't ask." He took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "I brought you into my home. I put you next to my daughter. I have a right to know who you are. I have a right to the truth." Tears began to stream down her pale cheeks, silent and desperate. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You would not understand. You would hate me." "Try me," he shot back, his voice raw with hurt. He felt like a fool. The whole town had been right to whisper. He had brought a complete stranger into his life, a woman with a past so dark she couldn't even speak of it. But she just stood there, shaking her head, her tears falling onto the simple white dress that now seemed like a lie. Without another word, she turned, fled to her room, and shut the door. He heard the faint sound of the bolt sliding into place. Eli stood alone in the center of the room, the silence roaring in his ears. He wanted to break down the door, to drag the truth out of her. He wanted to hate her for her deception, for making a fool of him. But as he stood there, trembling with a rage he hadn't felt in years, the image that came to his mind was not of the terrified woman in the locked room, but of Clara sitting on the porch, patiently sewing a dress for a corn-husk doll. He let out a guttural cry of frustration and slammed his fist against the rough log wall, the pain a welcome distraction from the storm raging inside him. Outside, the clear, starry sky had vanished. Dark clouds had rolled in from the mountains, and a low, distant rumble of thunder echoed his own turmoil. A flash of lightning lit up the room, and in that brief, stark illumination, he saw the bolted door to her room. It was a barrier he didn't know how to cross, and he had the terrible feeling that the woman hiding behind it was someone he didn't know at all. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the roof like accusatory fingers. The storm had finally arrived. The storm broke before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly quiet. The air that drifted through Eli's open window was cool and smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring into the darkness, listening to the rain lash against the roof, his anger slowly curdling into a knot of deep, aching hurt. He felt like a fool, played by a woman whose sad eyes were nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. He rose with the first light, his body stiff, his mind resolved. He would have the truth. He would not be put off by tears or locked doors. He strode to her room and found the door slightly ajar. The bolt slid back. A cold dread, heavier than his anger, settled in his gut. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The cot was neatly made, the thin blanket pulled taut. On the pillow was a folded piece of paper. His heart hammered against his ribs as he picked it up. Her script, as elegant and controlled as ever, felt like a slap in the face. It was not a confession or an explanation. It was only a few stark words. Mr. Robbins, please do not look for me. I cannot be the woman you and your daughter deserve. I am not worthy of the kindness you have shown or the home you have offered. Forgive me. Clara. The paper trembled in his hand. Not worthy. The words echoed her choked whisper from the night before. His anger evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of panic. He bolted from the cabin, his mind racing. He scanned the vast, empty landscape, the rolling plains that stretched to the horizon. She could be anywhere. She was on foot, with no money and no knowledge of this brutal country. Clara! His voice was hoarse, swallowed by the immense silence. He searched the barn, his gaze sweeping over the hayloft and the empty stalls. He ran to the creek, his boots sinking into the soft mud, following its path until he was sure she hadn't fallen in. Nothing. She was gone. He didn't waste another moment. He saddled his fastest horse, not even stopping for coffee or breakfast, and galloped toward Harmony Creek. The rage was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was a raw, clawing fear. He had been a fool, but not for trusting her. He had been a fool for letting his anger and wounded pride drive her away into the wilderness. He thundered into town. His horse lathered in sweat and reined in hard in front of the livery. The stable master, a grizzled old man named Jeb, looked up in surprise. "Seen a woman?" Eli demanded, his words clipped and breathless. "Tall, dark red hair, on foot." Jeb shook his head slowly. "Ain't seen nobody but you this morning. Eli, everything all right?" Eli didn't answer. He spurred his horse on. Stopping in front of the general store, he threw the reins over the hitching post and burst inside, startling a few early customers. "Have you seen Clara?" he asked the proprietor, his voice desperate. The man shook his head. Eli saw Mrs. Gable in the corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and righteous vindication. He ignored her poisonous gaze and hurried back outside. He went from building to building, his questions growing more frantic. The blacksmith, the preacher, the saloon owner who was sweeping up from the night before. No one had seen her. With each denial, the knot of fear in his stomach tightened. The townsfolk stared at him, a man unraveled, his usual stoic calm completely shattered. They saw a man who had brought trouble to his doorstep and was now paying the price. He saw only Clara's face, her terrified eyes at the festival, and the crushing weight of the sorrow she always carried. Defeated, he rode out of town, the whispers following him like ghosts. Where would she go? She knew no one. She had nothing. He reined in his horse on a small rise overlooking the vast checkerboard of homesteads and open range. She wouldn't have gone toward the mountains. It was too rugged. She must have stayed on the plains, following a road, any road, away from him. Then an idea struck him. About 2 miles north of his own property stood an old line shack, abandoned years ago when the previous owner had gone bust. It was a derelict structure, barely more than a pile of rotting lumber, but it offered shelter from the wind. It was a place to hide, a place to disappear. He urged his horse into a gallop, praying he was right. The shack was barely visible from a distance, its weathered gray wood blending into the muted colors of the prairie. As he drew closer, he saw fresh tracks in the damp earth leading to the sagging doorway. His heart leaped into his throat. He dismounted, his movements slow and cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. The inside of the shack was dark and smelled of decay and dampness. Rain had dripped through the holes in the roof, creating puddles on the dirt floor. At first, he saw nothing. Then, his eyes adjusted, and he saw a shape huddled in the far corner, wrapped in the shadows. It was her. She was sitting on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. Her dress, the simple white one from the festival, was stained with mud and soaked through. Her beautiful auburn hair had come loose from its pins and hung in a tangled, damp mess around her shoulders. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear. He couldn't tell. She looked small and broken and utterly alone. "Clara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were wide and haunted, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. "Go away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Leave me be, Eli, please." He took a slow step toward her. "I'm not leaving you out here." "You should," she said, a note of hysteria creeping into her voice as she scrambled to her feet. "After last night, after what you know, you should have just let me go. I am not what you wanted. I am spoiled." The word came out on a choked sob, full of a self-loathing so profound it made him flinch. "Tell me," he said, his voice soft but firm. He stopped a few feet from her, giving her space. "Tell me everything. No more secrets." She stared at him, her chest heaving, a desperate, hunted look in her eyes. He could see the internal battle, the urge to run versus the exhaustion of hiding. Finally, something inside her seemed to break. The fight went out of her, and she sagged against the rotting wall, her story spilling out in a torrent of whispered, shameful words. Her name really was Clara, Clara May Thompson. She'd been an orphan, raised in a grim institution in Boston where she was taught just enough to be a lady's maid. But it was her face, her looks, that had become her curse. She found work in a grand theater, not as an actress, but as one of the dancers in the musical revues. It was there they had renamed her Lily Bell. "It wasn't a respectable place," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "The dancing, it was just a prelude. The real business happened after the show. In private rooms with wealthy patrons. I was expected to be accommodating." She shuddered. "I learned how to smile, how to flatter, how to keep them at a distance without offending them. For a few years, I managed, but there was a man, the man from the festival, Silas Croft. He was powerful, and he became obsessed. He wanted to own me." Her voice cracked. "One night, he cornered me. He wouldn't take no for an answer. I fought him, and in the struggle, I cut his face with a letter opener. The theater owner threw me out that same night. Silas Croft made sure my name was poison. He spread rumors that I was diseased, a thief. No one would hire me. No respectable household would take me in. I was left with nothing but a reputation I didn't earn, a reputation as a fallen woman." She finally looked at him, her eyes swimming with tears. Your advertisement, it was a lifeline, a chance to be someone else, a chance to just be Clara, a plain, respectable woman in a place so far away no one would ever know Lily Bell. I lied to you, Eli, with every letter, with every moment I've been in your home. I've been living a lie. She took a ragged breath. Now you know. Now you know why you should leave me here. Eli stood in absolute silence, the weight of her story settling over him. He thought of her quiet dignity, her tireless work, her gentle hands making a dress for a corn-husk doll. He thought of the terror in her eyes when the snake appeared, and the identical terror when Silas Croft appeared. It was the same monster, just in a different form. All the pieces of the puzzle that was Clara, her grace, her sadness, her fear of scrutiny, slid into place. He was not filled with the disgust she expected. He was not repulsed by her past. He was filled with a searing, protective rage toward a world that could take a woman like her and break her so completely. He didn't say a word. He simply closed the distance between them. She flinched as he approached, expecting a blow or a harsh word of condemnation. Instead, he reached out and gently pulled her into his arms. She was rigid at first, her body stiff with shock. Then, as his arms wrapped securely around her, holding her tightly against his chest, a shuddering sob tore through her, and she collapsed against him, burying her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. He held her, stroking her tangled hair, murmuring her name over and over again. "Clara, it's all right. You're all right." He held her as years of fear and shame and loneliness poured out of her. After a long time, her sobs subsided into ragged breaths. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery moonlight began to filter through the cracks in the roof, painting them in stripes of silver and shadow. The air was filled with the sound of their breathing and the reawakened chirping of night insects. He loosened his embrace, tilting her chin up with his hand so she was forced to look at him. Her face was a mess of tears and dirt, but he had never seen her look more beautiful, or more real. The mask was gone. "Your name," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is Clara." It was a promise. It was an absolution. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, followed by a wave of gratitude so profound it stole his breath. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't move. She watched him, her lips slightly parted, her sea-storm eyes locked on his. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but something deeper, more elemental. It was slow and searching, a communication that went beyond words. He tasted the salt of her tears and the cool rain on her skin. It was a kiss of forgiveness for the secrets she had kept, and a plea for forgiveness for the anger he had shown. It was a kiss that acknowledged all her pain and promised to shelter her from it. He felt her tremble, and then her hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, returning the kiss with a hesitant, desperate longing of her own. In the ruins of an abandoned shack, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, Eli Robbins knew he had not found the simple helpmate he had asked for. He had found the woman he was going to love. They walked back from the abandoned shack under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, the moon a sliver of silver in the pre-dawn light. The silence between them was no longer a void of uncertainty, but a space filled with a fragile, profound understanding. He didn't hold her hand. Not yet, but his arm brushed against hers with every step, a steady, grounding presence. The world had not changed, but for them, everything had. Back at the cabin, he didn't point her toward her small, solitary room. He led her to the hearth, stoked the embers back to life, and put a kettle on to boil, while she sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, shivering slightly from the lingering chill. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He went into his bedroom, a space that had held the lingering ghost of his life with Martha for 3 long years. He gathered the few things that were solely hers, a tortoiseshell comb, a small, leather-bound book of poetry, a faded photograph, and placed them carefully into a small wooden chest. It was not an act of erasure, but one of reverence, a gentle closing of one chapter to allow another to begin. He then went to her room, the one that had served as her cell, and carried out the narrow cot. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was monumental. He was dismantling the barrier between them, brick by brick. When he returned to the main room, he found her watching him, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight, brimming with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of hope and fear, of gratitude and a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, "your place is with me." That night, for the first time, they shared a bed. The small bedroom was filled with the soft glow of a single lantern, which cast dancing shadows on the log walls. A profound hesitation hung in the air between them. For Eli, this bed had been a place of loneliness and memory. For Clara, the act of being with a man was tangled with a past of performance, coercion, and shame. He did not rush. He simply lay beside her, propped on one elbow, and looked at her. He traced the line of her jaw with a calloused finger, his touch so gentle it was barely there. He saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes, the ghost of Lily Bell, and he felt a fierce, protective need to banish it forever. He wanted her to know that this was different. This was not a transaction. It was a homecoming. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, searching kiss that held no demands. It was a question, an offering, and slowly she responded. A shudder went through her, a letting go of some tightly held fear, and her lips softened under his. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, tentatively came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. Their coming together was a quiet, sacred thing, a language of touch that spoke of all the things they could not say. It was in the trembling of her fingers as she unbuttoned his shirt, and in the careful, reverent way he undid the laces of her borrowed nightgown. It was in the soft gasp that escaped her lips when his skin met hers, a sound not of fear, but of awe. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of her own body, a discovery that intimacy could be an act of giving and receiving, of trust and tenderness, not of performance or survival. For Eli, it was the awakening of a heart he thought had died with Martha, a rediscovery of a profound connection that was both physical and spiritual. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the deep silence of the prairie, two lonely, broken souls found in each other a solace so complete it felt like a prayer, erasing the scars of the past and the boundaries that had kept them apart. They awoke to a world made new. The light slanting through the window was soft, and for the first time, Eli's waking thought was not of the chores that awaited him, but of the woman sleeping soundly in his arms. Her auburn hair was a fiery cascade against the white pillowcase, her face in repose, finally free of its sorrowful mask. Their life settled into a new rhythm, one of shared purpose. They rose together in the early morning darkness, moving around each other in the small cabin with an easy, synchronized grace. They cared for Ruth as a team, Eli lifting her onto his shoulders for a ride to the barn, Clara braiding her hair with a patient, gentle touch. The work of the ranch was no longer a solitary burden for Eli. Clara was there, her sleeves rolled up, helping him mend fences, her laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air when he taught her how to properly swing a hammer. He discovered she had a quick mind for numbers, and she took over the accounts, her elegant script filling the pages of his ledger. They were partners, in every sense of the word. The silence that had once defined their existence was now filled with easy conversation, shared jokes, and the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for words. But while their small world on the ranch had found a fragile peace, the world outside was growing hostile. The story of Silas Croft's appearance at the festival had spread through Harmony Creek, twisted and embellished with every telling. The name Lily Bell was now whispered with a salacious glee. Clara was no longer just the mysterious mail-order bride. She was a notorious woman, a creature of sin brought into their midst. The first official sign of the town's disapproval arrived on a Sunday afternoon in the form of Reverend Miller. The preacher was a tall, gaunt man who saw the world in stark terms of black and white, sin and salvation. He stood on their porch, his Bible clutched in one hand, his face a mask of grim concern. Mr. Robbins, he began, after refusing Eli's offer of a seat. I have come as a shepherd to his flock. There are rumors circulating, stories of a most unsavory nature concerning the woman you are housing. Clara is a good woman. Reverend, Eli said, his voice flat and hard, his body positioned squarely in the doorway. Be that as it may, the preacher continued, undeterred. Her past, whatever it may be, has cast a shadow on this community. As your spiritual guide, I must advise you to consider the reputation of your household, the moral upbringing of your child. You must sever this association. Send her away, for the good of your own soul and the soul of this town. Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The only thing this town needs saving from is its own hypocrisy. Clara stays. That is my final word. He looked the preacher dead in the eye. Now, unless you're here to talk about the weather, this conversation is over. The Reverend left, his back rigid with righteous indignation. But the encounter left a chill in the air. The battle lines had been drawn. The ugliest confrontation came a week later. Eli had to go into town for winter supplies, and he took Ruth with him. Clara had offered to come, but he had seen the fear in her eyes and told her to stay, as he was loading sacks of grain into his wagon, with Ruth sitting on the seat. A group of men ambled out of the saloon. They were led by a ranch hand named Finch, a man known for his cruel tongue and heavy drinking. Well, look here, Finch called out, a drunken smirk on his face. It's the respectable Eli Robbins. Tell us, Robbins, how's life with the famous Lily Bell? The other men snickered. Eli ignored them, tightening a rope over the supplies. I heard she learned some fancy tricks back in the city, another man taunted. Bet she keeps you warm on these cold Wyoming nights, eh? Eli's jaw was a knot of stone. He kept his back to them, his movements deliberate, controlled. He would not give them the satisfaction of a fight, not with his daughter watching. What's a lily bell, Pa? Ruth asked, her small voice cutting through the men's jeering laughter. Before Eli could answer, Finch stepped closer. Your pa found himself a saloon girl, little lady, a painted woman who danced for men for $1. The words, crude and vicious, struck the air like a whip, and they were heard, not just by Eli and Ruth, but by Clara. She had been inside the general store, having walked into town by a back route, wanting to surprise him with a small bag of peppermint sticks for Ruth. She stepped out onto the porch just in time to hear Finch's cruel declaration and to see the look of frightened confusion on Ruth's face. Eli turned then, his eyes blazing with a cold, murderous fury. You will not speak that way in front of my daughter again, he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. Finch and his friends, seeing the look on Eli's face, shuffled back, their drunken courage failing them. Eli said nothing more. He swung up onto the wagon seat, grabbed the reins, and drove away without a backward glance. The ride home was a journey through a wasteland of silence. Ruth was quiet, sensing the terrible weight of what had happened. Eli's own heart was a block of ice, but it was Clara who suffered the deepest wound. She sat beside him, her face pale and still, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She had seen the poison of her past touch the one person she had sworn to protect. She had brought shame and ugliness to this family. When they got back to the cabin, she moved like a ghost. She served supper, her movements stiff and mechanical. She did not speak. She would not meet his eyes. After Ruth was in bed, Eli reached for her hand, but she pulled away as if she'd been burned. Clara, he began, his voice aching. Don't, she whispered, turning away from him.
Please, just don't.
She retreated to their bedroom and lay down on the far side of the bed, her back to him. The wall he had spent weeks tearing down was rebuilt in an instant, higher and colder than ever before. He lay awake in the darkness, the space between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm, listening to the sound of her silent, heartbroken tears. For 3 days, a leaden silence filled the cabin. Clara moved through her chores with a spectral quiet, her face a pale, closed mask. The vibrant woman who had laughed with his daughter and worked by his side was gone, replaced by the ghost he had first met at the train station. She was polite, efficient, and 1,000 miles away. Eli's heart ached with every attempt he made to breach the wall she had rebuilt around herself. He would reach for her hand, and she would flinch away. He would speak her name, and she would pretend not to hear. She served his meals, mended his shirts, and at night, she lay as still and cold as a statue on her side of the bed, a chasm of heartbreak between them. He was beginning to despair, to fear that the poison of the town had finally seeped in and killed the fragile thing that had grown between them. The end came not as a quiet surrender, but as a terrifying roar in the dead of night. Eli was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep by a frantic shouting, followed by the terrifying sound of splintering wood and a low, hungry growl that was devouring the night's silence. A hellish orange light flickered against their bedroom window. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and boots. "Stay here with Ruth," he commanded Clara, who was already awake, her eyes wide with alarm. He threw open the cabin door and froze. The Petersons' farmhouse, a quarter of a mile down the creek, was engulfed in flames. The fire, fed by the dry timber and a stiff wind, was a monstrous, living thing, clawing at the black sky with fiery talons. He could see the silhouettes of figures running, their shouts of panic thin and reedy against the inferno's roar. Without a second thought, he grabbed 2 buckets and sprinted toward the blaze. Behind him, he heard his own cabin door open again. He glanced back to see Clara, a shawl thrown over her nightgown, running after him. Ruth trailing behind her, her small face a mask of terror. "Get back inside," he yelled, but his voice was lost in the wind. The scene at the Peterson farm was one of pure chaos. Flames had already consumed half the house, and the roof of the porch collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. Jacob Peterson and his wife, Mary, were huddled with their 2 young sons, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wild with terror. The few neighbors who had arrived were trying to form a bucket brigade from the well, but it was a pitifully inadequate defense. "Sarah!" Mary Peterson shrieked, her voice a raw, ragged sound of a mother's ultimate terror. "My Sarah is still inside, in her room!" Jacob tried to surge forward, but 2 men held him back. "It's no use, Jacob! The stairs are gone! You'll never make it!" Eli stood frozen, the useless buckets dropping from his hands. He could hear it now, beneath the roar of the fire, a faint, terrified wail coming from an upstairs window, which was already beginning to glow from the fire within. The heat was a physical blow, driving everyone back. It was a death trap, a suicide mission. The men looked at each other with helpless despair. No one was going in. And then something moved in the periphery, a flash of white. It was Clara. Before Eli could even process what was happening, she ran to the horse trough, plunged a heavy wool blanket into the icy water, and threw it over her head and shoulders. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look for permission. Her face, illuminated by the terrible light of the fire, was a mask of fierce, absolute resolve. With a cry that was swallowed by the flames, she ran straight for the back of the house, toward a small service entrance that was not yet fully engulfed. "Clara, no!" Eli screamed, a terror colder than any winter night seizing his heart. He started after her, but he was too late. She had vanished into the inferno. The entire crowd stood in stunned, horrified silence. All eyes were fixed on the burning house, which groaned and shuddered as if in its death throes. Eli stared, his breath locked in his chest, his mind screaming her name. He counted the seconds, each one an eternity of agony. He saw the face of Mrs. Gable, her mouth agape, her usual judgmental sneer replaced by abject shock. He saw Finch and his cronies from the saloon, their drunken smirks gone, their faces pale with awe and fear. In that moment, Clara was not a saloon girl or a fallen woman. She was a specter of impossible courage. An eternity passed. The roof began to sag. A section of the wall collapsed inward. "She's gone," someone whispered. And then, just as hope was extinguished, a figure stumbled out of the smoke-choked doorway she had entered. It was Clara. Her nightgown was smoldering. Her hair was wild, and she was coughing violently, but cradled in her arms, wrapped in the soaking blanket, was the small, sobbing form of Sarah Peterson. Clara took 3 faltering steps into the yard and collapsed to her knees, pushing the child into the waiting arms of her weeping mother. A collective gasp went through the crowd as they saw her left arm. The sleeve of her nightgown had been burned away, leaving a raw, angry red burn from her wrist to her elbow. A spontaneous cheer went up from the men, a sound of raw, unadulterated respect. Eli was already there, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid to believe she was real. "Clara," he breathed, his voice choked with relief. She looked up at him, her beautiful face smudged with soot, her eyes clear and present for the first time in days. The wall was gone, burned away in the heart of the fire. He gently scooped her up into his arms and carried her away from the chaos, away from the grateful cries of the Petersons and the stunned, admiring stares of the entire town. He carried her home. Back in the quiet of their cabin, he gently tended to her wounds. He washed the soot from her face and hands and carefully cleaned the burn on her arm, his own hands trembling uncontrollably. She sat silently on the edge of their bed, wincing in pain but never crying out. Her gaze followed his every movement, a new light in her eyes he had never seen before. He finished wrapping her arm in clean linen, his touch infinitely gentle. He knelt before her and took her uninjured hand in both of his, pressing it to his lips.
"I thought I'd lost you,"
he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked up at her, at the woman who had charged into a burning building for a neighbor's child. "You foolish, brave, wonderful woman." He rose and sat beside her, stroking the tangled, smoke-scented hair back from her forehead. "When I saw you run into that fire, my whole world stopped. Nothing else mattered." He paused, his throat tight. "If I had to choose again, Clara, knowing everything about your past, everything about the trouble it would bring, I would choose you. 100 times over, I would choose you." A single tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of release. He had not just accepted her past, he had embraced all of her, the darkness and the light, and loved her not in spite of it, but because of it. Later, lying in the darkness, the silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a sanctuary. The events of the night replayed in his mind, but all he could feel was the warm, living presence of the woman beside him. He felt her stir, and she turned to face him.
"Eli,"
she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. He waited, his heart still.
"I want to have your child."
The words were a quiet promise, a profound declaration that hit him with more force than the fire. For a woman like her, who had been so wounded by the world, this was the ultimate act of faith, of trust, of love. It was a choice to create life, to plant roots, to build a future in a world that had tried to destroy her. He couldn't speak. He simply gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel the beating of her heart against his. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, of smoke and courage and home. And when they came together that night, it was different than ever before. The gentle hesitation was gone. replaced by a fierce, celebratory passion. It was she who led, her hands exploring his body with a newfound confidence, her kisses deep and demanding. There was no shame, no fear, no ghost of Lily Bell in the room. This was Clara, a hero, a survivor, a woman in love, claiming her own desire, her own body, and her own future. It was not a mending of broken pieces, but the forging of something new and unbreakable in the heart of the flames. The fire changed everything. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but seismic shift occurred in the social landscape of Harmony Creek. When Eli drove the wagon into town, people no longer averted their gazes from Clara. They nodded. Some even offered a quiet, respectful, "Ma'am." The whispers had not vanished entirely, but their tone had changed from malicious gossip to awed retelling. The story of the beautiful, quiet woman who had walked into a burning building was already becoming a local legend. Mary Peterson, her daughter Sarah now clinging to her skirts, safe and sound, made a point to cross the street one afternoon. She stopped directly in front of Clara, her eyes brimming with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. She simply took Clara's bandaged arm, her touch feather-light over the healing burns, and squeezed her hand. It was an absolution, a public declaration of acceptance from the heart of the community. Clara, for the first time, did not flinch from the attention. She simply inclined her head, a quiet grace in her acknowledgement. Life on the ranch settled into a new, hopeful rhythm. The cold wall that had risen between Clara and Eli after the confrontation in town had been utterly demolished by the fire. Their love, tested by secrets and shame, had been forged in the flames into something stronger, more resilient. The nights were no longer filled with a chasm of silence, but with whispered conversations, shared dreams, and a deep, reaffirming intimacy. The desire for a child was a quiet, constant prayer between them, a shared hope for a future they were building together, day by day. The first snows of winter had just begun to dust the high peaks when the circuit mail rider brought a letter. It was an unusual occurrence. Their only correspondence was the occasional catalog from back east. The envelope was of a fine, heavy paper, a stark white against Eli's calloused hands. The address was written in a severe black script, and the postmark was from Boston. It was addressed to Miss Clara M. Thompson. The name felt like a relic from another lifetime. Eli handed it to her, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He watched her face as she took it, her expression carefully neutral as she broke the wax seal. As her eyes scanned the page, all the color drained from her cheeks. The paper trembled in her hand. She read it once, then again, her breath catching in her throat.
"What is it?"
Eli asked, his voice gentle. She didn't answer for a moment. She simply folded the letter with a slow, deliberate precision and placed it on the table as if it were a venomous thing. "It is from a lawyer," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. "My father, the man who raised me, he is dying." Eli moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. She was as still as stone. "I'm sorry, Clara." She shook her head, a bitter, mirthless smile touching her lips. "Don't be. He was a stranger to me for many years. He cast me out of his house when I was 17 for refusing the advances of one of his business partners. He is the reason my life took the path it did." The coldness in her voice was more chilling than any tears. This letter was not a summons to a deathbed reconciliation. It was the arrival of a ghost she thought she had long since buried. "That's not all," she continued, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floorboards. "He has left me an inheritance. He owned a large boarding house in a respectable part of the city, a profitable business. He has left it all to me." Eli felt a cold dread snake around his heart. A boarding house, a life of comfort, of respectability, a life away from the dust, the hardship, the judgment of this place, a life she deserved. That's a fortune. Clara." "Yes," she said. "But there is a condition." She finally looked up at him, and he saw the profound, familiar sorrow back in her eyes. deeper than he had seen it in weeks. The inheritance is mine only if I return to Boston to claim it. Alone. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and cruel. Alone. It was her father's final, controlling grasp, a posthumous attempt to sever her from the new life she had built, to erase the man and child who were now her world. He wanted to reclaim the daughter he had molded, not the woman she had become. Eli's mind reeled. He saw her slipping away from him, pulled back into the world that had so cruelly chewed her up and spit her out. The fear of losing her was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. But then he looked at her face, at the torment in her eyes, and he knew his own fear was a selfish thing. This was her decision, her life. He had promised to choose her, and that meant choosing to honor her freedom, even if it broke his own heart. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "I will not hold you back, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he fought to control. "It is a chance for a different life, a better one. Maybe. You should not have to live with the whispers here, with the memory of what happened." He paused, gathering all of his strength. "But if you go, if you decide you must go back to that place, then let me hold your hand and go with you. Ruth and I. We'll sell this ranch. We'll follow you. Your home is my home, wherever that may be." Her composure finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. His words were the ultimate testament of his love, an offer to abandon everything he had ever known, just to be by her side. He was not trying to keep her. He was offering to go with her into the lion's den. She stayed that way for a long moment, clinging to him as if he were her only anchor in a storm. Then, slowly, she straightened up. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand and looked at him, her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering love. She walked to the cabin door and looked out into the yard. Ruth was playing near the small garden they had planted, her laughter bright and clear as she tried to catch a wind-blown leaf. The late afternoon sun caught the gold in her hair, and she was the very picture of life, of innocence, of a future untainted by the past. Clara turned back to Eli, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face, transforming her features and erasing the last of the shadows. "I do not need his boarding house," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have already found my fortune." She looked past him, her gaze resting on Ruth. "It is here." She picked up the letter from the table, walked to the hearth, and dropped it into the flames. They watched in silence as the fine paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, taking with it the last ghost of Boston, of Lily Bell, of a life she no longer wanted. A few weeks later, as the winter settled in for good, a new family arrived in Harmony Creek. They were a minister, Reverend Abernathy, and his wife, a quiet, kind-faced woman named Sarah, sent to replace the fire and brimstone Reverend Miller, who had been reassigned. The Abernathys were different. They spoke of compassion and forgiveness, and they made it a point to visit every homesteader, no matter their reputation. They arrived at Eli and Clara's cabin on a cold, blustery afternoon. They sat at the table, sipping hot coffee, and their conversation was warm and genuine. After a while, Sarah Abernathy turned to Clara, her expression earnest.
Mrs. Robbins, Clara,"
she began, her voice gentle.
"we have heard what you did for the Peterson family, and, if you'll forgive my forwardness, we have heard some of the other stories as well, about your life before you came here."
Clara tensed, her hand stilling around her coffee cup.
"My husband and I," Sarah continued, leaning forward, "we believe that every woman deserves a chance to read, to write, to better herself, no matter her circumstances. There are women in this territory, good women, who have had difficult pasts, women who have been left with no choices and no skills. We want to start a small school for them, a place where they can learn in private, without judgment." She looked directly into Clara's eyes. "We need a teacher. A woman who can not only teach them their letters, but who can understand their struggles with a compassionate heart. We were hoping that woman might be you." Clara was stunned into silence. She stared at Sarah Abernathy, her mind reeling. All her life, her past had been a source of shame, a brand of impurity, something to be hidden and run from. Now, this kind woman was holding it up and calling it a qualification. She was being told that the very experiences that had broken her had also given her a unique strength, a rare empathy. She hesitated, the weight of the offer settling on her. To be a teacher, a leader, a beacon of hope for other women like her. It was a role she had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined for herself. She looked at Eli, who was watching her with a look of immense pride, his eyes telling her that he believed in her, that he knew she could do this. She took a deep breath, a lifetime of shame falling away, replaced by a nascent sense of purpose. She had been a dancer, a survivor, a mail-order bride, a rancher's partner. Now, she would be something more. "Yes," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I would be honored." A year passed, a quiet turning of the seasons that stitched their lives together with the threads of shared days and peaceful nights. The harsh Wyoming landscape, once a symbol of their hardship, had become the backdrop to their contentment. The winter snows melted, giving way to a spring of vibrant wildflowers, which then surrendered to the golden, sun-baked plains of another summer. Clara's school, held twice a week in a small room behind the Abernathy's new church, had become a quiet revolution. She started with 3 students, a widow who had been cast out by her late husband's family, and 2 young women who had arrived in town under shadowed circumstances. They came to her timid and ashamed, their eyes downcast, expecting judgment. Clara gave them none. She taught them to read and write, but more than that, she gave them back their dignity. She shared her own story, not the lurid details, but the feelings of worthlessness and fear, and in doing so, she created a sanctuary of shared understanding. Word spread quietly, and by the end of the year, she had 7 students. The women of Harmony Creek began to see her not as a woman with a past, but as a woman of substance. The name Lily Bell had faded into a forgotten whisper, replaced by the quiet, respectful title of teacher. The most profound change, however, was within the walls of their own cabin. It was no longer a place of ghosts and unspoken sorrows. It was a home filled with warmth and laughter. Ruth, now 7, blossomed under Clara's patient and loving guidance. She was learning her letters at Clara's knee, her brow furrowed in concentration as she traced the shapes of words in a tray of sand. One evening, as autumn was once again painting the creekside cottonwoods in hues of gold, Ruth came to them with a piece of paper clutched in her hand. It was her first proper school assignment from Clara, a short essay on a topic of her choosing. She stood before the hearth, her small figure illuminated by the firelight, and announced she was ready to read it aloud. "My essay," she began, her voice small but clear, "is called The Woman I Admire Most." Eli and Clara exchanged a smile, expecting a child's simple tribute. Ruth took a deep breath. "The woman I admire most is my mother, Clara. My first mother went to heaven when I was very small. I was lonely. Then Clara came on the train. At first, I was not sure, but she taught me how to make doll dresses and how to find the bluebell flowers. When the snake was there, she was scared, but Pa kept her safe. When the fire was there, she was not scared. She ran in to save Sarah Peterson because her heart is brave." Clara's hand instinctively went to her mouth, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Eli reached over and took her other hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. Ruth continued, her voice gaining confidence. "The men in town said bad words, and it made her sad. But my pa says they are fools. My mother Clara teaches the other ladies how to read. She is smart. She makes the best bread in the whole world. She sings me songs before I go to sleep, and her voice is pretty. She makes my pa smile. I love her. She is not my first mother, but she is my mother now, and that is what matters. The end." A profound silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Ruth looked up at them, her expression uncertain. Was it all right? Clara couldn't speak. She slid off her chair and knelt on the floor, pulling the little girl into a fierce, trembling hug. "It was more than all right, my darling," she whispered into Ruth's hair. "It was perfect." Over Ruth's shoulder, her tear-filled eyes met Eli's. In his gaze, she saw all the love and pride in the world. He had given her his name in private, but in that moment, his daughter had given her the one title she had never dreamed she would hold: Mother. A week later, Eli came to her as she was tending the garden. He stood before her for a long moment, simply watching her, a soft, wondering smile on his face. "Clara May Thompson," he said formally, "will you do me the honor of officially becoming my wife?" She looked up, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge on her cheek. "I thought I already was." "In here, we are," he said, tapping his chest. "But I want the world to know. I want to stand up in front of God and anyone who cares to watch and declare that you are my wife. I want to give you my name, properly." Their wedding was not held in the church, with its prying eyes and rigid pews. Instead, it took place on their own land, on a small, grassy knoll that overlooked the vast expanse of the prairie. The late afternoon sun bathed the world in a warm, golden light. Reverend Abernathy officiated, his kind wife Sarah standing as their witness, along with the entire Peterson family. There were no fine clothes, no elaborate decorations. Clara wore a simple blue dress, the color of a clear autumn sky, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Ruth had picked for her that morning. Eli wore his best clean shirt and stood tall and proud, his eyes never leaving her face. As they stood hand in hand, a slight breeze rustled the dry golden grass around them. To their right stood a large prickly pear cactus, a plant known for its harsh, defensive spines. But on this day, against all odds, it had produced a single, breathtakingly beautiful yellow flower, a miracle of delicate life thriving in an unforgiving land. It felt like a sign. Reverend Abernathy's words were simple and heartfelt, but Eli and Clara heard only the beating of their own hearts when he pronounced them husband and wife. Eli did not wait for permission. He pulled her to him and kissed her, a deep, possessive kiss full of love and promise, a public declaration for all the world to see. The final scene of that perfect day unfolded as twilight settled over the plains, casting the world in soft shades of purple and rose. They stood on that same knoll, long after their guests had departed, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. A gentle wind, cool with the promise of night, billowed the fabric of Clara's dress and sent loose tendrils of her auburn hair dancing around her face. She was standing slightly in front of him, her arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but in a gesture of quiet contentment. Her belly, once flat, now held a gentle, noticeable swell, a soft curve that held the promise of their future, the child they had prayed for. Eli moved behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, his large, calloused hands coming to rest protectively over the gentle mound of her abdomen. He could feel the faint, fluttering stir of life beneath his palms. Their child, a testament to a love that had refused to be broken. He bent his head, resting his cheek against her hair, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her. She leaned back against him, her body fitting perfectly against his, her head tilted up toward the endless, star-dusted sky. They stood there in silence for a long time, two solitary figures against the vastness of the prairie, no longer alone, but the center of each other's universe. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her temple. He thought back to that day at the train station, to the dusty, hopeless man he had been, expecting a plain,
sensible woman to ease his burdens. He thought of the breathtaking, sorrowful-eyed woman who had stepped off that train and completely upended his world. She was not the woman he expected. She was the woman he never knew that he was soul-deep desperate for. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you for stepping off that train. Thank you for listening to our story here at the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So drop a comment down below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel and share your thoughts with us. We appreciate every one of you.